All right, folks. Welcome to U.S. Society and Culture. For while we're not at school, this is going to be kind of going over the notes and stuff we're going to miss while we're gone. And I'll keep you updated through emails and be posting stuff on Moodle for you to use in class. So we're going to actually pick up the notes where we left off. Last time in class, if you remember, we were talking about the proliferation or the growth of news in the 1960s, people like Walter Cronkite, how he became the most trusted voice in America for information and news, especially as Vietnam continued to get worse. And then Watergate came in the 1970s, but we haven't gotten to that. And we finished off talking about Vietnam. You had that little handout I gave you on the last day we had school. Hang on to that, and whenever we get back to school, I'll be collecting that from you. It's only about a 10-minute assignment, so it shouldn't take you long to read that and get that finished. So we talked about kind of the war on television and how that changes America's view of war. Again, Vietnam was the first war people could watch on TV, and that has a great impact on people's public opinion about the war, right? Being able to broadcast from the battlefront, people like Morley Safer, who you read about in that reading assignment I gave you the other day. People are seeing war now in a very different way. You got to remember, in all previous American wars, the stories about them just came from the folks that fought. We didn't have right there battlefront first-person accounts of the things people see in war. So they're looking at they're looking at the Vietnam War through the lens of their television, and is giving them a very different perspective on the fighting and on the war. So it's a good thing to think about with that, right? So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about literature from the 1960s. So literature in the 1960s. Remember, in the 1950s, big literary movements happened with the Beat Generation, people like Jack Kerouac, and the writings that they had, kind of trying to capture, life for regular people. We saw comic books become unpopular in the 1950s, focusing more on stories of like aliens and monsters and murder and suspense stories. So in the 1960s, we kind of see another shift in focus from a lot of stories that fictional stories that are very popular to important books that cover really significant social issues of the day. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We mentioned the split level trap in the last unit a little bit, how it talked about a sense of men losing their individuality, rugged individualism, right? Something that we really talked about a lot during the 1950s, and how that was really important for men during that time. Okay, and we see books like that come about that really focus on how men have lost their identity to a certain degree. So we see a lot of books about hopelessness or the current condition people are dealing with in social rebellion. This again goes to famous books like Split Level Trap again, Catch 22. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. One of the most influential books of the 1960s was a book called The Feminine Mystique, written by a woman called Betty Friedan, who's like the mother of all feminists. Her book is, largely talking about how women want to kind of step out and not be restricted to the confines of being housewives, how they should seek personal fulfillment through education, through pursuing their own interests, through careers and things like that. This sets off the beginning of the women's movement that really starts during the 1960s and grows throughout the decades, and really grows during the 1970s. In the 1960s, we also see kind of the reemergence of comic books and superheroes as a popular form of escapist entertainment, especially for kids. Right now, they were really, really popular during the 1930s and 40s. Obviously, Superman, Captain America, Batman, fighting against the Nazis, fighting against crime, and all that sort of thing. They kind of lose popularity the 19 during the 1950s because we just didn't have the problems that we thought we had that we had during the 1950s, and of course we think we're living in this utopian perfect society in the 1950s, but you know that that's not the case. So a little bit more on kind of the idea of superheroes and comic books and stuff. So major books from the 1960s or writings, right? We're talking about the feminine mystique, Betty Friedan, women's opportunity to step out and fulfill their own individualistic goals. Split Level Trap, we talked about that quite a bit. The hopelessness of war and conflict with a book like Catch 22, kind of symbolizing that no matter what happens, it's a no-win situation. Either way, we're kind of screwed, right? So we see that popular as well. Finally, also in forms of books, we have Silent Spring. What's important about that book by Rachel Carson in 1962 is it ultimately is kind of like the Bible for the environmental movement. It's the first book to talk about, in any great degree, the threats that humanity has posed to the environment and the problems that come with that. So this book becomes kind of the beginning of the movement towards environmentalism, which we see grow a little bit throughout the 1960s and really start to emerge as a big force once the 1970s roll around. Now, in regards to comic books, a lot of big things happened during the 1960s. For one, I mentioned the X-Men here, or I'm sorry, the Avengers here, because obviously they're really popular now with the movies and everything. This is a cover from Avengers number 4, where they discover the frozen body of Captain America and the team of Avengers there that we recognize today as it's kind of right here. You got Ant-Man somewhere in there. Iron Man, the Hulk, Thor, all those guys. But the real big difference makers in the 1960s come in the form of the X-Men and Spider-Man. Now, the X-Men are a really interesting comic because they represent as mutants who are generally disliked and distrusted by society, kind of a metaphor for the civil rights movement of the 1960s and where that was going. The X-Men here, you got like Cyclops and Marvel Girl or Jean Grey, the Beast and Magneto and all that. They they kind of represent for us, this group of people who people don't really trust or like, and even though they're doing good things, people again aren't their biggest fans, and that becomes a really great metaphor for the way people felt about the civil rights movement during the time. The big difference maker during this time, of course, is Spider-Man. All right? Spider-Man debuts in 1962 and becomes really quickly a popular comic book figure. Spider-Man changes the way comic books are made in the sense that Peter Parker, who plays Spider-Man, is a teenager. And most of the folks reading comic books are teenagers or around that age. So he's a character that really represents the people that enjoy reading the stories. An example of this would be if you look at Bruce Wayne, who's Batman, right? Bruce Wayne is a super rich guy. He's a little bit older. he's not as easy to identify with for the readers of the comic as Spider-Man is. Same thing with a Superman, right? Superman isn't even human. He comes from another planet. His disguise is Clark Kent, right? So it's another example of a character that you can't really identify with in the same way. But Spider-Man kind of becomes really, really popular uh, and really is the linchpin that sets comic books off during the 1960s. You know, Spider-Man's a kid. Peter Parker's a kid. Peter Parker has problems. He's kind of dorky. He's a science kid, but yet he has these incredible powers that make him, you know, more athletic, stronger than everybody else. And on top of that, he's really, really intelligent, right? So as a character, um, so he kind of represents this idea of, you know, the the Spider-Man character is kind of his secret identity, right? He's one of the first, I believe, one of the first comic book characters to be, totally covered in a costume, right? So nobody can tell who he is. One of his big fights is keeping his identity secret. When probably as a kid, if you had all the talents and skills that he achieved through, getting bitten by this spider, he'd want to share it with everybody. But he has this calling to help others, to help humanity, to be this fighter against all these evil folks on there like the Green Goblin. You can see that may threaten him or people he cares about. So it's a real new direction for comic books, and you see in the 1960s what's called a silver age of comics. The comic book industry kind of going back to its roots of superheroes, and Marvel Comics really blows up during this time period. We're going to stop there for now, and I'm going to put a different post on later with some other stuff. And you can find this here pretty soon. Hopefully, I'll be putting it up, uploading it for you to look at. All right, folks, talk to you later.